Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Academia Sinica's special lecture today. We are very honored to invite Dr. Arthur Kleinman as today's speaker. Now let's welcome the president of Academia Sinica, Dr. James Liao, to give us an introduction about Dr. Kleinman. Welcome.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great honor to introduce our speaker of this special lecture, Dr. Arthur Kleinman. So Dr. Arthur Kleinman is currently Esther and Sidney Rabb Professor of Anthropology in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University. He's also a professor of medical anthropology and psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. It's a very rare combination. He's a distinguished member of both the U.S. National Academy of Medicine and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In 2022, Professor Kleinman was elected as an honorary academician of Academia Sinica. So on behalf of Academia Sinica, I welcome Arthur Kleinman to this lecture and extend a warmest welcome for his return to Academia Sinica for our convocation starting next week. We are deeply grateful that among his busy schedule in a trip in Taiwan, he graciously agreed to give this special lecture. Professor Kleinman's expertise span across multiple disciplines, including medical anthropology, cultural psychiatry, global health, social medicine, and medical humanities. He's also renowned for his extensive research in Taiwan and China. Throughout his distinguished career at the intersection of medicine, anthropology, China studies, and medical humanities, Professor Kleinman has devoted himself to both theoretical research and practical applications aimed at enhancing care in Taiwan, like many societies worldwide. We face the challenges of aging population, projected to become a super-aged society by 2026. Professor Kleinman's insights are particularly timely and relevant. The topic of the day he's going to discuss is the quest for wisdom in the art of living. I'm sure we all are excited and looking forward to his very insightful lecture. Let's welcome Dr. Kleinman.
Okay, if I speak Chinese, I'll go too slowly, and you won't leave here for 4 hours. So it's better for me to speak English and go fast. First of all, I'm an old friend of Taiwan. I first came here in 1969, and I have lived in Taiwan for 3.5 years over the course of my 55 years since that time. But Taiwan had a very big effect on myself, my wife, and our 2 children, a very big effect. And just to indicate it to you and make it's a relaxed lecture, my late wife was a great China scholar. She translated the Hohan Shu and the Chenzi Wen, okay? She died in 2011, as you'll see in this lecture, from early onset Alzheimer's disease, okay? My 2 children, my son is one of America's great pollution researchers. He's a soil scientist and who was invited by the Chinese Academy of Science to Wuxi to look at Taihu, Lake Tai, and help with the problem of eutrophication of pollution in the lake. And he remembered when we left Taiwan at one point and went to Wuxi in China, he remembered how the lake was crystal clear and now is a very polluted lake. My daughter also was deeply affected by being in Taiwan. She is a graduate of the 台湾师范大学幼稚园 and went from there to get her bachelor's degree from Harvard, her PhD from Yale in China Studies, married a Chinese American investment banker, and 2 of my grandchildren are Chinese Americans, okay? So I think that suggests that this is full circle for me. I'm 83 years of age. Using the sway system of China, I am 84, 80岁. So 我比较年轻的. What I want to do today is to talk to you about care and caregiving and suggest that this is one of the great topics of our time. And I will, at the end, illustrate it with the issue of aging research, of which I have a very big project in China, and we'll tell you about it in a little bit. So these are the books that I have done in the course of my life. I have written or edited 40 books, and I have, a number of them have focused on the topics of today, that we have today, particularly my books, The Illness Narratives, Rethinking Psychiatry, and The Soul of Care. But I'm also going to talk a little about the Tanner lectures that I gave at Stanford, and my work on social suffering, my work on ethics, the course that I teach at Harvard on Deep China, which I wrote a book with 7 of my former students, all of whom are now professors in China. And also the work I've done in global health with my former students, Paul Farmer, Ann Becker, Jim Kim, the former president of the World Bank, and others. So I want to begin with social suffering, the idea of social suffering, because this is what first attracted me to the field when I came to Taiwan. Wailala Taipei 第一次有很多没有钱的人 lots of poor people. This society was nothing like it is today. It was a very poor society. In fact, it was poorer when I came in 1969 than many comparative societies in Asia. So the initial thing that affected me was to see that the impact of social forces, how poverty especially affected health, so that they were inseparable. The fact that experience itself, let's see this thing here, experience itself of illness and suffering is always interpersonal. This is where I first learned about guanxi, about renqing guanxi, about the fact that guanxi in the family, in close friends, is actually moral and emotional. It's a renqing. This is also where I first learned that society contributes to health problems, and also that the structures created to respond to health problems in society can make health worse. That is, paradoxically, healthcare, as we're going to see, can actually make suffering worse. So I also learned here and in the early part of my life about the importance of violence. In 1969, I flew from Taipei to Jinmen, okay? We had to fly 100 feet over the water because every day there was bombardment to China and from China to Taiwan on Jinmen, okay? But I became interested in violence toward women and discovered that in Chinese society, there's a lot of violence toward women. I became very interested in structural violence, That is how poverty affects the body. Also political violence, street violence, and suicide. I wrote a book called The Illness Narratives. And I made a distinction in that book that's widely used in the United States today in medical schools. And that's the distinction between illness and disease. By illness, I introduced the idea that this was the innately human experience of symptoms and suffering, how the sick person and members of the family or wider social network perceive, live with, and respond to symptoms and disability. But disease was what the practitioners create in recasting illness in terms of theories in order to treat. And what I learned in Taiwan was that disease was not just disease seen by the shiyi, by the biomedical physician. It was different if there was a Lao Zhengyi, or if there was a Wui, a Dangi examining the patient. Subsequently, a lot of work has gone on in science, technology, and society studies to understand how the construction of disease is not just a natural mapping of disease onto nature, but is actually a socially constructed set of ideas. And I introduced the explanatory models questions, which at one time were taught widely in medical schools in Europe and the United States. And these were the questions to when I suggested that doctors could do a quick ethnography, as it were, in the office by asking these questions. What is the nature of the problem you bring? How has it affected you? Why now? Why does it occur now? Why did you come in now? What course will it follow? How does it affect the body? What do you think? Ni de igen. Bingren de igen. What treatment do you desire? What do I fear? What do you fear most about this illness and treatment? I also worked on culture in the clinic and how you could see culture, Chinese culture, but also many different cultures. In the United States, I was particularly interested in the multicultures that we see in American society, how a culture affects the illness experience, what its effect on biomedicine is, and its effect on the doctor-patient relationship. I spent 7 or 8 years in China studying the Yiwan Guanxi Wenti, which was a big problem in China. Actually, doctors were killed by patients because China lacking a medical legal system, you have what was known as Inao, Renao, the Nao. It was, you could rent a medical mob to attack the hospital and get the Lindau to give you money in response to a medical problem. That's not a good way to resolve problems, and China has gotten better, much better on that. This book was based on my Tanner lectures at Stanford and was an attempt to understand what really matters in people's lives as it relates to illness and care. What really matters chronicles stories of ordinary people and what matters most to them in normal and extraordinary times. It is a book about moral experience and how individuals and groups come to grips with very real dangers and uncertainties. Those dangers and uncertainties, as we shall come to understand, make life matter. They define what it means to be human and show where our world is headed. And it is a book about people who, in the midst of all that, are trying to live a moral life. So I'm suggesting here that Dao De is not moral, it's not some vague philosophical term. It's part of how we live our lives, whether they feel right to us or not. In my Tanner lectures, I argued that experience, Jingyan, Tiyan, is characterized by an orientation of overwhelming practicality in the face of real dangers and uncertainties. I learned that by studying Chinese society. the overwhelming practicality of life, very clearly demonstrated in studies of Chinese society. Why is it moral? Why is experience moral? Because there are things at stake for us that really matter in our everyday lives. That's what makes it moral. And it's realized in those local worlds we live in. We all face dangers. There's existential conditions, health, aging. We just heard about aging. In 2050, Arling Wu-Lingnian, 40% of Japanese will be over 65 years of age. 30% of Chinese in China, mainland China, will be over 65 years of age. Okay? There have never been societies like that in the history of the world with so many elderly. Japan today has more than 100,000 people who are over 100 years of age. Okay? China will have more than 300,000 people over 100 years of age very soon. Okay? It's unimaginable what 2050 will be like. Fortunately, I won't be here, okay? But you will be, many of you will be, okay? There also are accidents, okay? Actually, on the driving in Taiwan with very good drivers on the Gaosagunglu, I'm surprised you don't have more accidents. There's chronic and degenerative diseases. There are health catastrophes like stroke. And these are, they're economic conditions, job stability and poverty. I just came from China. China may have as many as 30% of its young people either unemployed or underemployed, okay? That's a very threatening for a society that made its contribution by raising 800 million people out of poverty. So I make a distinction between the moral and the ethical, and this is important for the lecture I'm giving today, because I want to emphasize the moral in illness and in treatment and in care, and I also want to emphasize the ethical. But they're not the same. From an anthropological standpoint, they're not the same. In medicine, we use them as if they're the same. But in anthropology, we don't look at them as being the same. So we think of moral experience as about the worlds we live in, the networks we live in, how there are things at stake, as I mentioned, that define what values we have. You go to a clinic, and the clinic says, Wei Runman Fu Wu, okay? But actually, if you observe what happens in the clinic, it's Wei Runman Bi Fu Wu, okay? It's not about serving the people, it's about making money, okay? That's a discrepancy between the moral experience of the clinic and the moral life of the individual. So many of us, in the settings we're in, disagree with the local worlds that we're in. We feel contradiction, okay? Almost every intellectual in America today feels a contradiction with the person who may become the next president of America, Donald Trump, all right? That contradiction is really a moral contradiction. They see Trump as a threat to democracy, okay? And they want to defend democracy. So when you go beyond the local and feel that there's something wrong with moral experience, and you want your moral life to be better, you reach out for the ethical. Trying to live a moral life can lead to the awareness that moral experience, as I just mentioned, is wrong. Some may respond with criticism, protest, do the right thing. Many people do nothing. Many people do nothing. And this is reflected in their sense of the moral life, all right? Thus, people come to collaborate in things they find unethical. In American universities today, this is the centerpiece of the debates on what's going on in the world and the issue of free speech in American university. This is the centerpiece of it. So the moral is not the same as the ethical. The ethical is our reach our reach for something beyond the local that seems right to us, that tells us that what is local is not right. The moral, what's local, can be terrible. It can be making money instead of helping people, making money on their illness, on their suffering. Okay. There's nothing wrong, by the way, with making money, but I'm suggesting that making money out of suffering, there is something wrong with. Okay? And you can think of how the local can be malign, can be evil. Think of the Holocaust, when the local was evil. Okay? So you could end up on the local with values just being the wrong values. That's why you're criticizing going beyond. I did a whole issue of Daedalus, the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, on this. So we reach for ethics. We reach for ethics. And ethics is a professional discourse. In medicine, we reach for bioethics. It's not like bioethics is something we construct all the time. It's there. It's a discourse that's been built. In America, it's built around autonomy, around a very strong sense of the individual that may or may not be relevant for other societies. But that's the American ethics. This is a book I did called A Passion for Society. Now this is very important for you if you're interested in what's the difference between medical science and social science. Okay? So I'm both. I'm both a medical scientist and a social scientist. Okay? When social science began, it began with great English and French figures in the 18th century and the early 19th century. Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, John Stuart Mill, Voltaire. They began systematic social inquiry, which became social science. And they said that social science should develop to reform the world and help people. But as social science developed, it became interested simply in generating social knowledge and got further and further away from the idea of helping people. And over time, key people in the social sciences, key researchers, theorists, tried to call social science back to the same concerns, really, that medicine in its origin had, which is helping people. Okay? Those were Max Weber, William James, John Dewey, Jane Addams, C. Wright Mills, W.E.B. Du Bois. Many, many figures in the social sciences tried to call the social sciences back to the idea of improving life and improving society. So over time, there's been a movement away from this concern. Think of the American university. When I went to Stanford University for my bachelor's degree in the 1960s, the early 1960s, the most important parts of the university were the humanities and the social sciences. They had most of the students. Today, when you come to Harvard University, my university, most of the students are actually in the applied sciences and engineering, even though we have right down the block from us a great engineering school called MIT, okay? Nonetheless, our students increasingly are going in that direction. There's a movement away from this idea that I call practical wisdom, but how do you improve life? How do you respond to life to make it better? Okay? Now, what I'm going to use to illustrate why this is so critical, why this may be the most critical issue we face today in the healthcare, in the healthcare system. I want to focus on caregiving and care. So caregiving, if you look it up in the Oxford English Dictionary, which is a good place to start in English, is characterized by attention to the needs of others, especially those unable to look after themselves. It's professionally involved in the provision of health or social care. It's attention to the needs of a child, an elderly person, an invalid. The Chinese tradition knew this, okay? If you read Mengzi, he tells the story of a child about to fall into a well, okay? He says that human nature is good because everyone, seeing the child about to fall in the well, would run to grab the child and prevent the child from falling into the well. That's his interpretation of caring as literally part of who we are. But we can define caring differently from an anthropological standpoint. We can define it ethnographically. Ethnographically here simply means what do we observe and interpret by looking at what people actually do. Okay? Anthropology is a descriptive profession like astronomy. It describes, okay? Both the individual and collective human process of giving care. And what is care? It's protection. Think of the way we protect a child from running out on the street and being hit by a car. Or we protect a baby from falling out of the crib. We protect an elderly person so they don't fall. Every year in my society, 1/3 of people over 65 years of age have a fall. A lot of what eldercare is about today is protect people from falling. Okay? It involves emotional support, however, interpersonal aid. And we'll see the other practical things like for people, especially at end of life, feeding, toileting, helping them ambulate, etc. And it's reciprocally linked to care receiving. What's important to remember, and often forgotten in medical settings, is that caregiving is reciprocal with care receiving. It's involved with bao, reciprocity. Okay? There are multiple levels of caregiving. You all recognize this. There's humanitarian assistance. That's caregiving at the collective level. There's professional caregiving. That's the Shiyishang or Zhengyi, Lao Zhengyi, giving care. There's self-care, the care we give ourselves. There's family and network caregiving. There's folk and religious caregiving. When I came to Taiwan, I want to just tell a little story if you'll give me a moment here. When I came to Taiwan first, 1969, I met with the then Minister of Health. And I asked him, well, I'm here to study the Taiwanese healthcare system. What do you think that includes? And he said, oh, it's easy. It's hospitals, clinics, and pharmacies. And then I did my research. And in the course of my research, I ended up at Lungshan Miao. And I don't know how it is today, but in 1969, Lungshan Miao was surrounded by healthcare facilities. It had hospitals, it had clinics, it had Lao Zhengyi de Menjeng, it had fortune tellers, it had shamans, it had all kinds of practices. And when I interviewed people there for my first book, Patients and Healers in the Context of Culture, I found that 90% of the time, families made their own decisions about where to seek care, when to seek care. And 70% of the time, the illness experience never left the family. Only 30% of the time did they go to see a traditional Chinese doctor or a Western doctor, okay? That made the family, which the Minister of Health at that time paid no attention to. It made the family the most important part of the healthcare system, as we know today. So when you go to America today, you see, what do you see on television? You see most of the ads are by biotechnology firms, by pharmaceutical firms, not going to doctors, not going to nurses, going to ordinary people, okay? Because they're the decision makers in care. And this would be a typical family setting. Here you have an elderly woman and an older daughter, and the daughter and the elderly woman together are going to make decisions about their care. The doctors can recommend things, but it's the family that decides. So what are the core tasks of caregiving? And here I want to really emphasize these for those of you who may be clinicians in the audience. We're a small audience today, but hopefully people will be here, see this on the internet. I've given this talk to thousands and thousands of people in different places around the world. Let me just tell you, the most important thing that's here is the ethical basis of care, which begins with acknowledgement and affirmation. That's what happens when a doctor turns to a patient and says, "Yoshimawunti." You're acknowledging the person as a human being, you're giving them respect, and you're asking them, what's the problem? That's the affirmation of their role as being sick and your response to it. Care involves practical assistance, feeding, bathing, ambulating, toileting, protecting. It involves emotional support. Emotional support. One of my colleagues at Harvard, who's one of our most famous professors, sent me an email the other day that his blood work seemed to have some real problems involved, that he might have the onset of a leukemia. And I said, just wait until the blood work is done again. And they did it again, and it was just a mistake in the lab, a lab mistake. But he got tremendously upset, and it was my role was giving him emotional support. So take your time, be careful, wait. Let's see what it turns out to be. Moral solidarity. Moral solidarity, maybe some of you have had this experience. You have a family member who's at end of life, and they no longer recognize you. Maybe they're even terminal, and they go into a period where they're in a coma, or they're simply unaware of what's happening around you. You're still there at the bedside. Often we call that a vigil at the bedside. That's moral solidarity and responsibility. Presence. Human presence means that in caregiving, we don't expect the doctor to be outstanding in the moral domain, but we expect them at least to show respect, to show some respect, and to be present, not mechanical, okay? To be there. Okay? Enduring. I learned this from all the time I've been in China. If I've learned anything from Chinese society, it's the importance of enduring. I think that your generation in Taiwan and the generation in China has not learned this, okay? The older generations know this. They've lived through tough times. You've got to live through tough times to recognize how important it is to endure, to keep going, to not give up, okay? I think young people today feel much more entitled. They don't expect tough times, okay? Well, they better wake up because they're going to experience tough times. We all have to endure, okay? Additional tasks are consultation with financial, legal, religious, and psychological advisors. And these are just some pictures to illustrate this. I like this Picasso picture. It's at the bedside. This is what I meant by the that it's interpersonal. See, you can't see where the head of the caregiver and the head of the patient are separate, because the idea is that they're fused, that care is this reciprocity, this fusion. The same thing in Rembrandt. That sixth space between the two, that's the space of caregiving and care receiving. This is a very famous picture by Sir Luke Fildes of the doctor at the end of the 19th century, when there were very few medical treatments that were had any use at all. The doctor simply was there with a young child who's clearly probably having a fever related to an serious infectious disease. And the doctor, you can see, is looking at the child, both with concern for her, but also wondering what to do next. It's that uncertainty that is part of care. Okay? Oops, going the wrong ways. Did I? Yeah. This is from work of my colleagues at Partners in Health at Harvard in Lesotho, one of Africa's poorest countries. The patient here has AIDS, is dying of AIDS, surrounded with family. You can see again, the concern is not just the patient, but the family. So from the standpoint that I bring, caregiving is an existential act that defines our humanity and our relations with others. It's one of the things in life that really matters. It's a basic response to the fact that we live in worlds that are dangerous and uncertain. And it defines the human condition. There is no anthropological evidence of any society that has not had care at its core. In practice, it's not a burden so much, although we think of it sometimes as a burden, but simply a way of being in the world. You're giving care. It's an aspect of moral experience and ethical aspiration in a global culture of cynicism and sense of misplaced loyalty. Caregiving is often perceived as one of the truly worthy objects of ethical commitment. Okay? On a practical level, actually caregiving has little to do with medicine and the other helping professions. Most of care is given in the social network by families. Yeah. I show this for a particular reason. On your right is the only time that Picasso painted a medical student, okay? And on your left is a famous painting during the Cultural Revolution that got its painter into deep trouble, okay? That painting on the left was seen as criticizing Mao, okay? It was, an owl with one eye closed, all right? Almost winking, okay? But the Picasso painting has been seen differently. Picasso himself gave some implication of what he meant by this painting. He meant that the doctor has one eye closed to protect his own self from being overwhelmed by the care he gives or she gives, and she has one eye open to do all the things I mentioned in caregiving. One eye closed, one eye open. Well, we have evidence in the United States. Hopefully the situation in China is much better, and in Taiwan much better. But we have evidence in the United States that first-year medical students are better at caregiving than fourth-year medical students, okay? That means, for a medical educator like me, that's profoundly disquieting, okay? Because it means that we actually do something in medical school that makes the caregiving skills of young doctors worse, okay? Now, there's no reason for this, just in the same way that we're educating young doctors in science and technology and doing a good job, we should be doing a good job on care, but we're not. And I'm going to talk about that because that's really the focus we need to have. That suggests that maybe if Picasso were alive today, which regrettably he is not, he would paint this picture with both eyes closed, okay? So this is the book that is really central to what I'm talking about today. I just came from Shanghai, and my publisher in Shanghai, actually from Beijing, but they came to Shanghai. We had a wonderful, we had 500 people at the 5th printing of this book, and I signed the book for 500 people. And it was sort of wonderful to see the attention. And we had a great discussion with, at the brand new Tushuguan in Pudong, a beautiful, beautiful library, over the content of this book. So the first thing that I suggest in this book is that the symbol we have for medicine is wrong, okay? The Greek symbol we have for medicine is the so-called rod of Asclepius, okay? It is a winged staff with a serpent, a snake, wound around it, okay? But actually, since medicine is reciprocity, it's patient and family, patient and doctor, we should have two snakes wound around it. And actually, there is such a caduceus. It's the caduceus of Hermes or Mercury. So I've appealed to the American Medical Association to change the image, but I got no answer back. Now, I want to tell a personal story about care, okay? So you bear with me. 我告诉你，我跟你讲啊，我告诉你关于我自己的故事, okay? Okay. This was my marriage day. That was me when I was a young medical student. And this was my bride, my wife, Joan. That was 1965, 65年, okay? And this was Joan and I when I was a resident in psychiatry at the Massachusetts General Hospital, and she was studying Chinese with a great scholar at Harvard called Achilles Fang. This was Joan in her 40s, 50s on the coast. This was Joan and I in our 50s. This was Joan at the end of her 50s, 58 years of age, 59, when she started to have the symptoms of early onset Alzheimer's disease. And her symptoms began in the occipital lobe of the brain, which is unusual in Alzheimer's. Usually it begins in the parietal and temporal lobes. And because it started in the occipital lobe of the brain, her first set of symptoms were increasing problems with sight, with seeing, and eventually she became both blind and developed dementia, okay, from her disorder. And this was her as she was beginning to have the effects of the Alzheimer's on her mind. This was us in our garden early in her experience of Alzheimer's disease. And this was her well along in the 10-year journey she had with Alzheimer's. And we have a beautiful, magnificent, actually beautiful cemetery in Cambridge, which is a national historical cemetery called the Mount Auburn Cemetery. And this is her gravestone. She died in 2011. And my adult children and I tried to figure out what could we say about her. We said beauty, wisdom, goodness, above all love. And you can see there's plenty of space for my name under it. Now, I didn't just lose Joan in 2011. In 2000, about 6 years after losing Joan, my mother died. That was a different death. She was 102 years of age, my mother. Okay? My mother felt that God had forgotten her, okay, and had allowed her to live too long, okay? And she was very clear, had no dementia, no cognitive problems. But this was the third death that I experienced, and this was 2 years ago, when my most important student that I've had 100 PhD students, 250 postdoctoral fellows, thousands of undergraduates, medical students, and MA students. This was Paul Farmer. Paul Farmer was the most important medical humanist in the world, medical humanitarian in the world. He was a medical anthropologist like me, had been my student, was a wonderful infectious disease physician, this is him in the hospital he built in Butaro, Rwanda, which shortly before his death, which is called now the University of Global Health Equity in Rwanda. He founded it, was the chancellor, and he died taking care of patients. He had severe hypertension, and he had a heart disease, but his commitment was to care for patients, and he died caring for patients. And this is Paul and I, because we taught together. So caregiving is also about loss, about death. And if you look at the last thing here on the list, it suggests that when someone dies, we don't just forget about care. We go on to care for memories. That's what bereavement is. That's what our life afterward is. And these are all the things I mentioned earlier about care. And they're the center of the book. Now, I want to say a few other things. One is that care and caregiving are inseparable from human development. If we look around the world, we know that care is deeply gendered. If you simply measure care around the world, the vast majority of care is given by women. The pressure is on women from the word go. They're socialized toward care in almost every society. And the uncompensated care of women is the glue in every society. The uncompensated care, that uncompensated care. They're not paid for that care. Men are socialized differently. Men are not socialized toward caregiving. They're socialized toward other interests, risk-taking, for example. And over time, men have not done a very good job in stepping up to match the care that women give, but we're getting better at it. And that's what happened in my case. For 36 years, my wife took care of me. For 10 years, I took care of her. I believe in the future, as we see the younger generation, I'm really optimistic about this. The relationships that they have to care are very different from those of you in the audience who are over 30 years of age. Okay? They seem to be more inclined for men to participate in care more. If you go to Australia today, where when a child is born, both the mother and the father are given time off that time, you often see fathers pushing the little babies into a coffee shop. Australia has the best coffee in Asia. And when you see that, it's because the men are being paid. The men are getting paid by the government to be caregivers, okay? So these are the challenges of caregiving and why I'm giving this talk, okay? There's a crisis in long-term funding for care. In my society, very few people have insurance for long-term care because it's extremely expensive. And insurance companies make it that way because they lose money off of writing long-term care insurance. In China today, one of the great things in China today is that they are trying to provide long-term care insurance for everybody, including poorest people in rural areas. They're pouring money into that to try to provide long-term care insurance, okay? Increasing numbers of people are entering the workforce, including women, hence there are fewer people at home to give care. The values of our time are not the greatest values for caregiving. Most of us are raised in a time that is about autonomy, your own interests, the radical individualism of my own society. It's not really oriented toward care. And there are knowledge and communication gaps that I'll talk about in a bit. But we look at professional care, and we see that there's limited time for interacting with patients. I just came from Shanghai, where I went to one of their great hospitals, Shanghai. In that hospital, their most famous doctors for gastrointestinal disease. You see a professor, an associate professor, 3 postdocs, 2 residents, seeing 500 patients in an afternoon. Okay? Every patient is seen between 3 and 5 minutes. It's impossible to give good care in 3 to 5 minutes. Okay? Impossible to give good care. Now, why are they in that situation? Because China has failed to build a primary care system. It's learned that lesson, and it's trying right now very hard to have a jiating yizheng in everyone in every city, to have a jiating yizheng, a family doctor. But it's really hard, and they're having difficulty in doing this. Nonetheless, they're trying very hard. Electronic technology. You would think, and we want technology. I believe in technology. We want it to improve care. But all the evidence we have in the United States is that frequently technology worsens care. The best example is the electronic health record. So poor is the electronic health record in terms of its ability to contribute to care that the only value it's had in the United States is to improve billing, okay? That means that we should have that record be able to integrate someone's care, to help the doctor. But in fact, the doctor is so focused on trying to find out what were the test results that she has her back turned to the patient. There's almost no communication initially because she's trying to figure out from the screen what in fact is happening to this patient. Why is that? Do you know why that is? Because the electronic medical records were made, they were developed by electrical engineers, okay? They're great at prototyping, but they don't know anything about care. So they've organized the records in a way that are useless from a medical perspective. Okay? It's kind of like I don't know how many of you have Teslas, okay? If you love cars, you don't drive a Tesla, okay? If you love computers, you drive a Tesla, okay? Okay. And also the incentives for quality care. The incentives for quality care have gone down. Now here's something that may surprise you. I've given this talk in many settings where people have been surprised by this. We do not measure the quality of care. We do not measure the quality of care. Not in China, not in Taiwan, not in the United States, not in Japan, not in Europe, not in South America, not in Africa. Okay? What do we measure? We measure institutional efficiency, which is the number of patients with condition X moving through the healthcare system at Y speed with Z outcome. That is not a measure at all of quality. It's a measure of efficiency. Now, I'm not arguing against efficiency, but I'm going to make the argument, I am making the argument, that the quality of care should matter most in healthcare, and efficiency should be a second virtue, not the first. Okay? To measure care directly, we need to measure the following dimensions of the patient-doctor, family doctor, and or patient-family relationship. Time, quality of interpersonal relationship, quality of communication, including listening, explaining, following up, quality of the physical exam, the history taking, and of clinical judgment. None of those things are measured. Not a single one. So there are 3 paradoxes today in medicine. One is, what is the place of caregiving in today's medicine? Second, what is the place of caregiving in medical education? And third, does caregiving actually suffer from technological development in medicine? Paradox 1. Medicine traditionally defines caregiving as central to the practice of the doctor. Over time, caregiving has become less central to medical practice, so that today, if you actually measure what doctors do, their actual involvement in caregiving has become less and less. Even nurses today do less care, as they have to do all other kinds of tasks. It's the hugong, the nursing assistants, who do the care, and the family members, the jasu. The paradox, we don't spend sufficient time or money on caregiving, either in practice or the curriculum, yet we still consider it to be central to what medicine is. That's what's called a paradox. Okay? Paradox 2, medical education. I already mentioned this to you. Medical students are both more interested in and better at the practical, emotional, and moral aspects of caregiving when they enter medical school than when they graduate. The paradox, there is something about medical education that disinterests and disables students from caregiving. I don't know if any of you in this audience know about Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift, Dean Swift, was one of the great figures in English literature. He wrote Gulliver's Travels, okay? Swift wrote at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century in Ireland. During that period of time, there was the so-called Irish famine. The Irish famine killed many people in Ireland and led to many Irish people migrating to America, Australia, New Zealand, other places in the world. Swift was upset that the English were not doing anything about the Irish famine. So his intention was to provoke them. He wrote a famous article called A Modest Proposal. And in that article, he suggested that adults should eat their children. Because if they ate the children, we didn't have to watch the children slowly die, and the adults would save themselves. And this produced outrage in England, as you'd expect. And he said, yeah, that's great, outrage. Turn it now to the famine. Do something about the famine. So I have a Swiftian proposal for medicine, which is, why don't all medical schools simply drop caregiving from the curriculum, okay? Get rid of caregiving, okay? Regard the doctor as a mechanic. Now, every one of us here who owns a car has taken his car to a mechanic, okay? If you have a Lexus or a BMW or one of the new Chinese electric cars, you don't expect the mechanic to put his hand on the car and say, I hope you're okay. It's good to be with you today. Okay, I'm gonna use some mechanical wrenches. I don't mean to injure you in any way. Okay, we don't expect that from a mechanic. Okay, because mechanics are not about care. They're about doing something to the car. Well, that's my suggestion. We treat medicine today, well, you go to medical school, you become a mechanic. Very high level, you get good pay. We'll take care of you on the pay side, but don't worry about care. And I have given that talk at half of America's medical schools. And as soon as I say that, okay, half of the audience hands go up. Okay? Americans, quick to respond. Hands go up. And they say, well, this is ridiculous. We didn't invite you here to tell us to get rid of care. We want to improve care. And I hear one thing after another. Someone once said, I'm sorry we invited you. We wanted you to talk positively about care, not negatively about it. And so I said, okay, just like Swift, take that anger improve things about care in the curriculum. Spend more money on care. Train doctors better. If they can't provide evidence of being good at care, don't let them graduate from medical school. Okay? And the last one, just to make it quick, is that technologies, in my view, should always improve care. But in fact, as I've already suggested, sometimes they don't. They make care more difficult to do. That's a paradox. They should always improve care. So what can be done? On the familial side, we can provide long-term care insurance for families. We can compensate women and men for family care. It's going to be mostly women, okay? Because that's who's giving most of the care. I have a project in China on caregiving. I started this project by asking 50 men and women, husbands and wives, about the care they provided for their elderly parents. And the sons, the adult men, said, well, you know, I'm very Confucian. We give very good care to my old mother, okay? We provide her with meals. We pay for where she lives, or the building she's in. We're always there talking to her. And I say to the men, when you say we, who actually does that? Who actually cooks the food and brings the food to your mother? And then it turns out to be the wife who does that, okay? So my suggestion is we compensate women and men when they do it for care. Governments should do this. Why should they do this? Because in my society, if 10% of families stopped caring for their elderly people, it would overwhelm our whole system. Hospitals, nursing homes, just a 10% change would be overwhelmed. Hence, it's in the interest of society to make sure that home care works. In China, they have now a policy for the elderly called 就是七三. 90% should age at home. 7% should receive community support. Only 3% should be in a nursing home. They're having a lot of trouble at getting that percentage, okay? But if they compensated people at home, I think they would easily do that. On the professional side, we should strengthen the moral training of the professional caregiver, the doctor and the nurse. We should improve training in the core caregiving skills. We should incentivize caregiving. And we should replace the economic language, which now dominates health policy, with a clinical language which emphasizes care. I think I'm going to skip these because these are basically just more details about the points that I have made. I do want to take on one point, though. Most of us have been socialized in your society and mine, and in China, toward the idea of resource scarcity. That's the fundamental idea of public health today, that resources are inadequate in the health domain. Hence, some people who have more resources can get better care, and lots of people who have less resources won't get that level of care. Paul Farmer and many others have shown that in almost every circumstance, you can mobilize resources to provide care. He showed that for AIDS and TB, in double-blind clinical trials and the like, you could give the same care that is received by middle-class people in Boston to poor people in Haiti and Africa, okay? We need to reject the idea of socialization for scarcity. We cannot accept the idea that some people get less care. That is a fundamental commitment we should have in the health domain. A socialist society like China in theory has that commitment, but in practice, they have trouble honoring it. A capitalist society like the United States doesn't have that commitment, but needs to have a commitment like that. So what I'm trying to do is to stimulate a moral movement for care in my society. I'm saying we should recognize that there's a bias in our time about care. We should advocate and do community work to generate a moral movement, and we should make the legal and policy interventions to support family care and social care. The recommendations for medicine are to make fundamental changes in medical education that emphasize the skills of caregiving. We should make changes in healthcare systems that don't allow for 3 to 5 minute encounters, which are impossible for care. Okay? And we should respond to burnout. Now, this is an interesting development. This is a development in the United States. I don't know whether this is in Taiwan, whether this affected Taiwan. But in the United States, more than 50% of doctors claim that they're burnt out. And if you ask, well, what do you mean by burnt out? They 睡不好觉, 没有精力, 心里不舒服, feel that their work, they can't do the work they want to do. They can't give the care they'd like to give because of the way the system is organized and payments are given. This is有一个系统问题. This is a systems problem. I think burnout is just classical alienation, that people are alienated from their work because they aspire to some level of care, but they can't do it because of the system. So here's the end of what I'm saying. I want to suggest that we learn something from a great figure in the past, Aristotle. Aristotle said in his famous Ethics, moral excellence comes about as a result of habit. We become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, brave by doing brave acts. And I would say we become caring and caregivers by doing acts of care and caregiving. And then I want to end with 2 things that my former student, the late Paul Farmer, said, which I think are extremely important. For me, he said, as a doctor, an act of moral clarity is you're in front of someone who's suffering, and you have the tools at your disposal to alleviate that suffering or even eradicate it, and you act. And he also said, the idea that some lives matter less is the root of all that is wrong with the world, okay? And I end with William James. So if those of you who are in medicine here, you read my essays in the Lancet on William James, you'll see that William James, who was a doctor, understood all the things I presented. He died in 1910. He knew all these things and wrote about them brilliantly in his work. He was the most important American philosopher, and maybe the only original American philosopher. William James said, the solid meaning of life is always the same eternal thing. The marriage, namely of some unhabitual ideal, however special, with some fidelity, courage, and endurance, with some man's or woman's pains. You think through what William James said. It's what I just gave as a lecture is what William James said. Caregiving, I believe, is the most important part of healthcare systems. And indeed, in an aging society, it is an inevitable part of every life. The quest for wisdom in the art of living is how can we make care better? And how can we make ourselves better as caregivers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arthur, for a very stimulating talk. We do have some time for a few questions. Yes, Kevin?
Thank you for your the profound work that's based on extraordinary experience and reflection. It's remarkable that you opened your talk with Taiwan in the 1960s. It's poverty and it's suffering. I was in a conference this past weekend, and there's a conference on traditional medicine in East Asia and the history of medicine. And the speakers there alluded to the problem of the care today, which is that we now live in isolation. And we lost the support of the extended family and community that was there in the past. And today in your talk, it seems to me that you assume care is between individuals. And I wonder, where is the community? Or how are you going to formulate the place of community in the ideal care that you have in your work? I'm not saying that you don't care about the community. What you do today is communal work.
Yeah.
But it's how do you formulate it, and what would you do? Thank you.
Well, first of all, that's a great, great question for me. And it's almost as if I set you up to ask that question. Okay? So thank you so much. So we have excellent research now on community approaches to the treatment, let's say, of depression and anxiety. My colleague, Vikram Patel, who's the Paul Farmer Chair of the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School, has done wonderful research in India and Africa, showing that you can train community healthcare workers who only have a primary school education in supportive care for depression and anxiety, and they can have the same outcomes that psychiatrists do in more affluent societies. So we're seeing now for the first time in America the development of community programs in the mental health field aimed at this community intervention in care. And it's a really interesting process. This is a reverse learning in global health. So global health has been principally about wealthy societies working in poor societies. But what this work shows, is how what's learned from poor societies can actually come back to affect a wealthy society. So in my society, the states of Texas and Illinois, 2 states, have taken the community practices in Africa and India that Patel has developed and are redeveloping them in their states. So my feeling is we're going to see, going forward, much more activity by communities in this regard. And you remember the example I gave you from China, that China wants to have 90% of people cared for at home, elderly, 7% in the community, 3% in nursing homes. In order to do that, they are trying to revitalize community care. I'll give you an example of this in my own project. So I have a project called Social Technology for Global Aging and Eldercare in China at Harvard. Okay? This project involves 6 of Harvard schools, 14 full professors, more than 20 students, both undergraduates and graduate students and medical students, on our side, on the Harvard side. And in China, many of my former students. I have had the privilege of training some of China's most outstanding psychiatrists and anthropologists. And I have a whole bunch of them contributing, being part of the study, in fact, being equally involved in this particular study. And part of it is involving community. So let me give you one example, if I can. One of the participants in our study is Professor Connor Walsh from our School of Engineering at Harvard. And Connor has developed an extraordinary prototype. It's a pair of thick pants tied to a motor and a battery. And it allows a person who's had a stroke or has Parkinsonism to walk normally. It's quite amazing to see. We showed this to over 100 elderly women in high-rise buildings in Shanghai. And we got the same response 90% of the time. The women said, off, whoa, 非常好, yeah, 了不得, but I'd never use it. 没有用, okay? Well, and the engineer said, well, how could you say that? How can you say it's great, but you'd never use it? And they said, well, so dangerous is it to cross a street in Shanghai. I would never trust these pants to walk across a street, okay? So the engineers were deflated, but the anthropologists asked, well, if you don't think this is useful, what would be useful to you? And then we got these terrific responses 90% of the time. I am isolated, just like you said. I'm 90 years of age. I'm living in this apartment. I have mobility problems. I cannot walk easily. I have 6 friends. They're all in different high-rises. They are the same age, and they have the same problem I do. We can't get together. If you could figure out a way to get us to a tea house once a week and get us back safely, that would make the world of difference in our lives. That's what we want from you. Well, that's really interesting. That suggests, again, just what you're talking about. How would a community develop that? And actually, that's what we're working on right now. So just to give you a sense of what we're doing, it turns out it's much easier not to have these elderly groups go to a tea house, but to actually have the tea house come to them in the community space in these high-rise buildings, okay? That means bringing the elderly to the community space. For that, the technology you need is not the pants, but what we're trying to develop now, which is an exoskeleton for the arms, which increases your strength 2 or 3-fold and allows you to lift an elderly person out of a wheelchair and put them into a seat, okay? Take them down from the 40th floor of a building to in the elevator, to the ground floor, et cetera. That's community intervention, and that's what I believe we're going to see a lot, just like you suggest, we're going to see a lot of that going forward. So I'm all for community. Now, I thought you were going to ask me about something else, which I sort of shortchanged in this talk, and that's self-care, self-care. So I didn't talk about that very much. And let me just say something, let me use your question to say something about self-care. So there is a pernicious view in the United States, which is being picked up around the world, which is very dangerous in my view. It says to young people, you find yourself by going into yourself, and there's a true self there. You bring that true self forward and out, and that's it, you live your life, okay? That's a Hollywood error, okay? And it's tied to a terrible term that I try never to use, which is the word resilience, okay? Resilience is a Hollywood term, okay? It means that you're faced, you go, hundo de yali, okay? But no problem, meawunti, okay? You're like a rubber band. You get stretched and it comes back. But you know in Taiwan in the summertime, if you put a rubber band outside, okay, it doesn't stretch so well. And if you stretch it out, it breaks. And that's what happens to all of us. That's what happens to us when we lose someone, when we take care of someone. We break a little. That break, is not easy, but it's also the opportunity to grow in that break. And self-care is really, in my view, much more important than the way we usually configure it as a kind of selfishness. Self-care really means we go out to others, provide care. That's where we find who we are, okay? I'm 83 years of age, okay? If I look inside myself, the one she buds out, okay? Really messy, can't figure things out, Who am I? What am I here for? You go out in the world and do things for others. You give care, okay? You write about it. You try to influence care. That's where you find yourself. You find yourself going outward, and that leads to self-care. That leads to much better self-care. I never took care of myself before my wife got very ill. Didn't do it. When I was caregiving for her, in order to be there for her, I needed to take care of myself, I discovered. That's when I started working out in the morning. That's when I discovered I could work out with her, even though she had dementia. We could do it together, et cetera. So that's a long-winded answer to you, but everything you suggested is important. The community is important, and the self is important. Thank you.
Okay, we have one more question, perhaps?
Dr. Kleinman, my name is Shu Jianxu. I work in the National Yangming Jiaotong University Institute of Community Community Health Care. My professional background is psychiatry, mental health nurse, and geriatric and community. I received the scholarship from the Ministry of Education in my country and go to the United States to study caregiving, nursing. And at that time I found it's interesting, especially you separate, in your country you separate the informal and formal care. And the formal care is professional care. Informal care is family care. At that time, it's 1990. For me, I feel, in my country, family care is formal care instead of informal care. And when I study in the UCSF, it's a top one of nursing school in the United States, and the sociology department is in School of Nursing. And we have the AIH, Clinton, design the healthcare reform in our School of Nursing. At that time I asked, how come the aging, the elders care always emphasize independent life, and no man will take care of the very few will do the caregiving job. So for me, I think you are quite a brilliant husband, man. 你是一个有良心的男人，照顾你的太太10年。好，那 and in School of Nursing, I have taught almost 30 years. I was so exciting when I read your Soul of Care. So I lead my PhD students in our class study your illness of narrative and the Soul of Care together. And we even conduct a community study club to study your Soul of Care. So for me, I have 2 questions. The first question is that like the concept of care and caregiving for the doctors, medical doctors in my country, I feel that's important. However, they are so busy with the cure, busy with the national health insurance. 他们太忙, they are too busy. And however, I feel just like you say, if they just take care of the cure, take care of the risk of the patient, not themselves. The self-care is so important. They are poor men. Okay, and the second question is that, so the first question is, are there any strategy or, I think it's a complex for the medical education. The second question is for myself. Because like a caregiving kind of philosophy or knowledge or practical wisdom, we always talk about that. Like the burden or the being. Like actually in the United States, my teacher, Patricia Benner, she's the first one to bring up the Heidegger philosophy into nursing. And Barbara Bauer defined a different type of intergenerational caregiving.
Right.
So for me, I feel the caregiving is such important knowledge. Everyone needs to know. However, in my discipline, it's so central. So I just wonder how, because you are such a master, I'd like to ask you, how can, do you have any suggestion for the nursing field? Like probably
Sure.
You have the colleague in your country. How do you talk with the nursing scholars? And how can we, if you will cite any reference from the nursing field, or do you have any suggestion for my professional field? Thank you.
Well, those are both wonderful questions, so let me respond to both. Yeah, I have a lot of things, first of all, that for doctors that we should do, and a number of them are in the Soul of Care, but they're also in other things that I published in the New England Journal of Medicine and in the Lancet about care. And I think that it begins with making care so important in medicine that we actually examine students on their caregiving skills. So the distinguished president of Academia Sinica is a biochemist. And when you go through medical school, you get examined in biochemistry. You don't pass biochemistry, you don't go on in medical school, okay? The same thing with caregiving. Today, we don't examine the caregiving skills in the same way we examine the biochemistry. We should. And if you don't pass in the caregiving skills, you can't go on in medical school. We graduate from Harvard. From Harvard, we graduate medical students who cannot give care. Okay? That should not be the case. Should not be the case. Most of our medical students, fortunately, can give care, but some can't, and they shouldn't graduate from medical school. All right? But we need to put things in, and we are right now. So across the United States, there's a big movement in so-called medical humanities. It's teaching medical students more broadly about humanistic approaches to care, literature, social science, interpretive works of art. For example, at my university, my medical school, we take medical students to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston to look at art and to listen to art historians interpret the imagination that goes into art as a way for the doctor to build imagination in caring for patients. The same thing in the music area and the like. So there are things in the medical humanities that I think are really important. And I think my experience, you know, before I was at Harvard, I was at the University of Washington, where I headed a major division at the University of Washington Hospital. And we insisted that every clinical chief, cardiology, hematology, hepatology, had to demonstrate outstanding caregiving skills in front of residents and students, okay? And that's done. And the third thing is today, I don't know if we have any clinical teachers here in medicine. I'm going to say something that's going to seem outrageous, but it's really important. we shouldn't let residents within 200 yards of medical students, okay? Why is that? I was a resident. I'm sure there were people here in the audience who did residencies in medicine. When you're a resident, you can't get out of the bloody hospital, okay? Hence, you want to shortchange everything. You want to do everything quickly, get it done, all right? The resident is the worst teacher you could imagine because she is in a survival mode. She needs to get out of the hospital to have a life. Everything that we teach about caregiving is reversed by the residents. And I have plenty of evidence for this, and there are many, many papers on this. Okay? Residents tell students, don't spend so much time speaking to patients. I've got lots of other things for you to do. We got to get it done. Fill out this paperwork. Someone's got to do the paperwork. Get it done. Don't speak to the patient, okay? That's the reverse of everything I've just said. So I think that we can't turn education and medicine over to residents. It has to be physicians. Why do we let residents do it? Because they're the lowest paid, they're the cheapest way of doing medical education, okay? Just doesn't work. And then for nursing, well, nursing, everything I've said you can read in the great nursing texts, and you know that. Nightingale, when she wrote her great text on nursing, said everything that I said here. So nursing is a central field for caregiving. However, in my society, I don't know about your side, my society, nurses are doing less and less care today. They're filling out forms, okay? They go around, fill out forms, they're not doing the care. Who's doing the care? The care is being done by hugong, by nursing assistants, okay? Again, I don't know your society, but I do know China, and the hugong in China, tamen the wunwa bijadi, tamen they don't have much education toward care. They themselves, middle-class patients, don't see themselves interacting well. The hugong are not trained, or even worse than the hugong would be the baomu, okay? The baomu are from rural areas. They don't have any training. They don't even know what they're supposed to do in that setting. And yet, if you go to Shanghai, it's mostly baomu taking care of elderly people. So then we need training, we need education for them. We need to make them good caregivers, and they can be. They can be. That's the message of community care. If you train people, they can be great at doing care, okay? But they require training, education. That's the key. Thank you so much. It was great to talk to you. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for giving us a very inspiring talk. I'm sure that everybody has a lot to think about and reflect on our own society and everything we do. Thank you again. Thank you.